History does not begin with dry dates and names carved into the granite of textbooks, but with a barely perceptible yet persistent feeling that something is wrong. This feeling is similar to the uncanny valley effect, when an object looks almost human, but tiny details give it away as an artificial fake, causing an instinctive chill. This is exactly how the official picture of the 19th century feels if you stop glancing at it casually and really look at the details. We are told that this was an era of great progress, an industrial leap, and the triumph of reason. But you only have to step back slightly from the usual dogmas and the facade begins to crack. Instead of lively scenes of a developing civilization, the researcher is presented with strange, silent stage sets. Majestic avenues stretching to the horizon, colossal domes and antique colonnades carved with mathematical precision create an impression of grandeur that simply does not fit the declared level of technology or population size. These spaces seem not just empty, but abandoned, or what is even scarier, prepared in advance. The cities stand like empty shells waiting to be inhabited, like a giant machine that was stopped and is now waiting for a restart. Official history avoids this screaming dissonance with surprising consistency, blaming the empty streets on the technical limitations of early photography or sheer coincidence. But as evidence accumulates from different corners of the planet, these explanations hold up less and less. The emptiness becomes not a bug, but a systemic feature. These are not scenes of ordinary life from which passers-by have accidentally disappeared. This is a portrait of a world where life was put on pause. Chimneys stand in rows, yet no smoke rises from them. Market squares capable of holding thousands are absolutely deserted. Perfectly smooth roads stretch into the distance, knowing no wagon wheels. Every detail screams that activity should be bustling here, but in every frame a deafening silence reigns. It is here that the most disturbing thought arises, one capable of overturning our entire understanding of the recent past. What if the 19th century was not a bridge between the past and the future, not a smooth evolution, but a hard barrier? What if we are looking at the traces of a global restart of civilization, where the old world vanished or was swept away, and the new one was just beginning to unfold on its ruins? In this version of history, the grand architecture is not the achievement of those who lived in it, but a legacy inherited by new inhabitants who arrived to find everything ready. But who were these new inhabitants? Where did they come from in these empty metropolises? The answer to this question leads to an even darker secret. Parallel to the deserted cities, at the exact same time, a phenomenon is observed that official science acknowledges but cannot clearly explain. This is the sudden appearance of an ocean of children, emerging as if from nowhere. Empty cities and overflowing orphanages are two sides of the same coin, two anomalies that when superimposed cease to be accidents and turn into stages of a single hidden process. To understand the true scale of this deception, we must first carefully examine the stage on which this drama unfolded. Those stone labyrinths that seem to have been built not by people, but for people. Examining the architectural landscape of world centers like Paris, St. Petersburg, Vienna, or San Francisco in the mid-9th century, the researcher faces a paradox that is impossible to ignore. In a negligible amount of time by historical standards, these cities turned into monumental metropolises whose grandeur is overwhelming. Entire districts built up with huge stone buildings appeared with such speed that even contemporaries expressed bewilderment. Construction records are often vague or completely absent, creating the impression that massive facades appeared on streets that had barely been cut into the earth. A close study of the buildings reveals granite and stone blocks processed with a precision that seems impossible for the primitive tools of that time. Giant domes, slender colonnades, and complex molding look more like the legacy of an ancient, highly developed civilization than the result of early industrial attempts. They do not look like newly built objects, but like ancient structures that were simply excavated and restored.
But the most frightening element of these urban landscapes remains their lifelessness. Metropolises designed for millions stand completely empty. Wide avenues capable of holding entire armies are free of traffic. Roads disappearing into infinite perspective know no wagons. Industrial chimneys lined up in rows release no smoke, as if factories and plants were stopped in an instant. Market squares where trade should logically be bustling are devoid of sellers and buyers. Every detail of the infrastructure screams that there should be life here, but the scene remains sterile. Skeptics often try to explain this phenomenon with the technical peculiarities of early photography, claiming that long exposure times erased moving objects, leaving only stationary architecture. However, this explanation crumbles upon detailed analysis. Long exposure turns moving people into blurred, ghostly silhouettes, a haze or smeared spots. But on thousands of photographs from different continents, there are not even these traces. Moreover, it is impossible to imagine that in a busy city, absolutely everything was in constant motion. Someone would surely stop to talk, a wagon would wait to unload, a street vendor would stand by his stall, but they are not there. Shadows from trees and buildings remain sharp, indicating a reasonably short exposure time, and yet the streets are empty. This emptiness repeats with frightening regularity from Europe to America, from Australia to the Russian Empire, becoming a global signature of the era. There is a persistent impression that these cities stand ready, but dead. These are not the construction sites of a developing civilization, but stage sets waiting for actors. The architecture looks excessive for the population officially recorded in these cities. Metropolises designed for hundreds of thousands barely counted tens of thousands in censuses, raising a logical question: why build so much for so few people? The answer suggests itself. The cities were prepared in advance, before the arrival of the main population. They were inherited, not built by those who settled in them. And here a logical abyss opens. If the cities stood empty, where did their true creators disappear to? And more importantly, where did that new wave of people come from who soon filled these stone corridors with no memory of the past? While the streets of monumental cities kept an unnatural silence, a different noise began to rise behind the walls of government institutions. In the mid-9th century, as if by an invisible signal, the world faced a phenomenon that official chronicles try to mention only in passing. It was the sudden appearance of an ocean of children, a global wave of orphans that covered the planet with frightening synchronicity. Overnight, everywhere, not just shelters, but real palaces for foundlings began to be erected, gigantic complexes resembling industrial facilities in scale. Archives have survived numbers that don't fit into the usual understanding of demographics. A single institution could accept up to 4,500 babies in just one country. Over a short period, dozens of large orphanages appeared, and this happened simultaneously in Europe, America, and the Russian Empire. We are offered the standard explanation: wars, epidemics, and poverty. However, when these factors are overlaid on the map of events, the construction of official history begins to shake. Wars are always local and limited in time. Diseases spread unevenly, and economic crises have their cycles. Here we see a process that happened everywhere and continuously, regardless of whether military actions were taking place in a specific region. The infrastructure for housing children arose so quickly and was so voluminous, as if the world was preparing in advance to accept a huge number of nobody's people. The most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon remains the total absence of roots in the registration books of those years. Voids gape open. The columns for parents, place of birth, and origin were often left unfilled. It creates an eerie impression that an entire generation appeared literally from nowhere, deprived of ancestral memory, family ties, and a past. These were phantom children, the ideal blank slate for populating a new world. They did not know who built the majestic cities in which they were to live, and they had no connection to the previous era. Thus, Two key figures appear on the historical board: empty metropolises fully ready for life, and millions of children with no past. These two anomalies complement each other perfectly, like a lock and key. But the presence of the container and the content is not enough. To connect them, to distribute this huge mass of people across empty territories, complex organization was required. Children needed not just to be fed, they needed to be moved over vast distances, sorted and directed to their destinations. It is here that charity ends and the cold calculation of global logistics begins, turning living people into a resource for settlement. When the scale of a problem overgrows the possibilities of local solutions, systemic organization comes into play, and this is exactly what we observe in the mid-19th century. The ocean of children overflowing the...
If you look at this process without the rose-colored glasses of charity, it becomes obvious this was a program of a state and possibly global level for populating territories. Empty cities and farms needed hands, and the system provided them in abundance. The term repopulation, reseeding the population, fits here much better than rescue. However, even the most perfect logistics cannot explain the main thing. The transport network only distributed the resource, it did not create it. The numbers of transported and placed children run into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Where did such a quantity of babies and orphans physically come from to continuously supply this giant machine for decades? Wars and diseases do not produce such a stable and massive influx of newborns. To find the source of this human raw material, we have to look where the science of that time intersected with entertainment, and the birth of life was put on public display as a technical achievement. The answer may hide in the most crowded places of that era, at the world's fairs. While trains were distributing nameless children to their new homes, something bordering on surrealism and going far beyond medical necessity was happening in the epicenters of public life. We are talking about the phenomenon of public incubators and the strange activities of figures like Martin Cooney. Instead of quiet and sterile hospital wards, the latest technologies for nursing infants were demonstrated in places where they seemed completely out of place, on noisy boardwalks, in amusement parks, and at world expositions. These devices stood next to circus performers, carousels, and food stalls, turning the struggle for life into an entertainment show. People paid for admission to walk along rows of glass boxes containing tiny premature babies. Medical staff in immaculate white uniforms performed their duties under the intense gaze of a crowd chewing on sweets, while street barkers invited them to look at living dolls. The official legend says that traditional hospitals rejected incubators, and such exhibitions were a forced measure to fund the saving of lives. However, the scale of this industry makes one doubt the noble version. According to the organizers, tens of thousands of babies passed through such institutions. A logical question arises: where did such an incredible number of premature babies appear from at specific collection points? Why did parents allegedly give their newborns en masse to showmen for public amusement? The context in which these demonstrations were held causes particular alarm. Very often, pavilions with incubators were located in the immediate vicinity of sections dedicated to eugenics, an ideology obsessed with selection, improving the human breed, and population control. In one hall, visitors were told about methods of selection and creating the ideal citizen, and in the next, they were visually shown technologies allowing life to be maintained and grown outside the mother's body using machines. This proximity looks not like a coincidence, but like a unified exposition of a new world order. The psychological effect of such spectacles was colossal. Society was gradually and imperceptibly accustomed to the idea that a child is not necessarily the fruit of family and love, but an object that can be placed in a technical device, optimized and controlled. The baby behind the glass became an exhibit, a product of science separated from parents. The line between natural birth and biotechnological production was blurred under the sounds of fairground music.
The technological base for mass cultivation was ready, logistical routes were laid, but the last task remained, to finally cement this norm in culture. This required soft but widespread propaganda that would enter every home in the guise of harmless and even funny images. If incubators were the hardware of this new system, then postcards became its software, a cultural tool designed to reprogram the collective consciousness. In the early 20th century, Europe and America were flooded with a strange visual phenomenon which modern researchers often write off as the whims of Victorian humor. The market was inundated with thousands of postcards featuring identical but very specific subjects: babies growing in cabbage fields like a bountiful harvest, children hatching from giant eggs, or newborns being delivered by storks dressed in the uniforms of postmen or couriers. At first glance, these images seem like a harmless illustration of folklore, a fairy tale for the very young. But upon closer examination, this fairy tale begins to resemble an instruction manual or a production report. The alarm intensifies when attention switches from the pictures to the text. The captions on these postcards are devoid of metaphor. They are frighteningly literal and transactional. On hundreds of examples circulating at that time, the inscription "All Vente," for sale, is clearly visible. Other cards imitate the language of the commercial market: new arrival, fresh goods, we fear no competition, goods non-returnable. Babies are depicted lying on merchant scales, packed in wooden crates for transport, or tagged with descriptions of their qualities, as if they were agricultural product or manufactured goods. There are images of children in cages with price tags, where human life is presented exclusively as an object of buying and selling. This could not have been an accidental joke by lonely artists. The mass scale and global reach indicate that these were, in a sense, price lists and catalogs of a new era. Why was this specific imagery implanted at the exact moment when millions of parentless children were filling state institutions? These postcards served the function of soft propaganda, a subconscious training of the population. They erased the biological link between parent and child from people's minds, removing the process of natural birth from the equation. Instead of mother and family, the concepts of delivery, distribution, and acquisition came to the fore. The visual culture accustomed the layman to the thought that children are not born in pain, but appear ready-made, found in cabbage, brought by couriers, unloaded from trains. It was psychological preparation for a reality in which truly population replenishment happened through external logistical channels, not through birth canals. These colorful, sometimes comical pictures served perfect camouflage for a process that was anything but natural. They normalized the unnatural, making it acceptable and mundane. And now, as this final fragment falls into place, the scattered details of the 19th century begin to come together with frightening clarity into a single mosaic. The impossible architecture of silent cities, the inexplicable influx of orphans, the industrial scale of transport networks, the public demonstration of artificial growth technologies, and the commercialization of childhood in mass culture. All this ceases to be a set of coincidences. Before us opens a panorama of a grandiose operation, the true meaning of which has long been hidden behind the screen of progress. When all these scattered anomalies, silent stone giants, legions of children without lineage, the industrial logistics of their movement, and the cultural normalization of artificial arrival into the world appear on one canvas, the official chronology of the 19th century finally crumbles to dust. It becomes obvious that this period of history was not a bridge connecting an archaic past with a technological future, but a solid wall, a barrier hiding the